The chip talked to her for the first time on a Tuesday, 3 days after they put it in. She was in the commissary of the processing station on Reach 7, eating something that passed for oatmeal. The voice arrived, not in her ears but behind them, low and resonant the way a tuning fork sounds when you hold it to bone. It said, in the language of the Veth Collective, "Compliance is optimal, refusal will be corrected." Mara Voss set down her spoon. She looked at the grey paste in her bowl. She picked the spoon back up and kept eating. That was the first thing to understand about Mara Voss. She had a particular relationship with bad news. She didn't panic. She didn't freeze. She ate her oatmeal, and she started making a list inside her head, the way her father had taught her to do when the farm flooded, when the bank called, when her brother didn't come back from the transit accident on the Ganymede connector. "You couldn't eat the flood," her father used to say. You could only eat what you had in front of you and figure out the rest while chewing. She was 31 years old. She had dark crescents under her eyes from 14-hour shifts, and her knuckles were calloused from 3 years of assembly work in the station's fabrication bays. She had 940 credits to her name and a mother back on Earth whose neural degeneration was progressing in the slow, inevitable way of things that cost money to slow and more money to stop. She had agreed to the Veth's voluntary integration program because it paid 4,000 credits for 6 months of participation, and 4,000 credits was the number her mother's specialist had mentioned, offhandedly, the way specialists mention numbers they assume you can't reach. She hadn't told anyone she'd done it. That was the second thing to understand about Mara Voss. She was private in the way people get private when they've learned that asking for help usually results in the help not coming. The Veth were not a cruel species in the way humans sometimes imagined aliens to be cruel, with teeth and appetites. They were a precision species. They had achieved their particular form of galactic dominance through optimization, through the elimination of inefficiency at every scale, from the cellular to the civilizational. The voluntary integration program was precisely what it claimed to be. A voluntary program in which human participants agreed to host a Veth-designed neurological interface for 6 months in exchange for compensation, data contribution, and what the documentation called enhanced biological monitoring. The Veth had been doing versions of this with 17 other species for over 2 centuries. The data they collected had advanced medicine on 12 worlds. The interface was removable. The consent forms were thorough. There was an appeals process. What the consent forms did not cover, because the Veth had never needed to cover it, was what happened when the interface encountered a host who didn't respond to correction the way the model predicted. Voice came back that evening, while Mara was running diagnostics on Bay 4's thermal coupling array. It told her to stop what she was doing and proceed to Sublevel 3, Corridor 9. A Veth technical supervisor named S was waiting with updated interface calibration protocols. It did not ask, it stated. The distinction was important to the Veth. Asking implied the host had a choice. The host had signed a contract. The contract specified compliance windows and adjustment periods and optimization parameters. The voice was not asking. Mara finished the diagnostic she was running. It took approximately 4 more minutes. Then she went to Sublevel 3. S was a small Veth, barely shoulder height on Mara, with the characteristic pale amber coloring of the technical cast. Its translator rendered its speech in flat, precise English. It asked Mara why she had taken 4 additional minutes to comply. Mara said she had needed to finish the diagnostic or the coupling array would have flagged an incomplete sweep and triggered a maintenance review that would have taken 2 hours to resolve. S processed this. It said the interface had recorded the delay as a compliance deviation. Mara said she understood. Escher said future deviations would result in correction stimuli. Mara said she understood that too. She walked back to her quarters with her hands loose at her sides and her face neutral. In the corridor, she passed a woman named Adezeze who worked in hydroponics and had also signed the integration contract 3 weeks before Mara. Adieze looked at Mara the way people look at each other when they're both in the same trap and neither of them has said it out loud yet. A long look, a quick look away, a walk that continued without stopping because stopping would have been a deviation. Mara lay on her bunk that night and stared at the ceiling and let herself be afraid for exactly 20 minutes. She timed it. Then she was done being afraid and she started thinking. The interface operated on a feedback architecture. She'd read enough of the technical documentation to understand that much. Monitored compliance through a cascade of neurological markers, stress hormones, motor intention signals, autonomic responses, and when it detected patterns that fell outside the acceptable range, it issued correction. Correction, in the documentation, was a euphemism for what was actually a targeted neurological stimulus that produced a sensation roughly equivalent to the moment before a migraine hits. Not pain exactly, but the promise of pain, the certainty of it, the body's sudden conviction that something was about to go very wrong. You could push through it. The documentation suggested you couldn't, but the documentation had been written by Veth, and Veth optimization models were based on Veth neurology, and Veth neurology was not human neurology. This was the thing the Veth had not yet learned about humans. Humans had a long and intimate history with discomfort. Because humans liked discomfort. Because discomfort had been so constant, so various, so inescapable throughout human history that the species had developed a relationship with it that other species that had found comfort faster or had been granted easier circumstances, simply hadn't. Humans could tolerate, humans could endure, humans could keep eating their oatmeal. The first real test came 6 days later. The voice told her to leave the station on a supply runner and not come back. Mara understood. From context she'd been assembling piece by piece from fragments of overheard Veth technical conversations, that the interface was attempting to relocate her to a secondary processing site on the outer ring of the station complex. Integration parameters were less monitored and adjustment could be more thorough. She understood, in other words, that she was being moved to somewhere she would have a harder time resisting. She didn't get on the supply runner. The correction that followed was the worst she'd experienced. She sat on a crate in loading bay 2 with her hands gripping her own knees and her jaw clenched, and the certain knowledge spreading through her nervous system that everything was about to be catastrophically wrong, and she sat with it the way you sit with a wave when you know it's too big to fight. You let it break over you and you are still there when it's done. S arrived 9 minutes later. It asked Mara why she had not complied. Mara said she had experienced a medical episode and had been unable to safely board. S said the interface had recorded no medical episode. Mara said her own body was telling her differently. There was a pause. The Veth, she had noticed, did not handle the gap between their data and observable reality particularly well. Their optimization systems assumed data primacy. If the data said X and the host said not X, the model had a process for that, but the process was slow because it had never needed to be fast. No other integrated species had ever successfully argued with the interface's medical sensors. S told her to report to the medical bay for evaluation. Mara went. She sat in the medical bay for 4 hours while Veth Instruments confirmed she was entirely healthy. She thanked them for their thoroughness and went back to work. That night she found Adieze in the hydroponics bay, ostensibly checking growth cycles, actually hiding in the green smell of it. The humid warmth that didn't feel like the station, that felt like something older. Mara sat down on the floor between rows of bean plants and looked at the ceiling and said, quietly, "I need to know how many of us there are." Ade sat down beside her. She said 8. She said she'd been counting. Mara said, "Can you get them together?" It took 3 days to arrange without triggering compliance flags. They couldn't gather in groups. The interface monitored social clustering patterns. So instead, they passed information, but had always passed information under surveillance, in pieces through intermediaries, in the margins of legitimate activities. A phrase added to a maintenance log that only someone looking for it would find. A calibration request that, if you read the equipment IDs in a certain order, spelled something else. Adeze knew a man named Torben who worked environmental systems and had, before the integration program, spent 2 years doing signals analysis for a deep space communications relay. Torben was very good at encoding things in noise. What Mara needed to pass was this: the interface could be confused, not defeated. She wasn't under any illusions about defeating it, but the Veth model assumed a one-to-one relationship between interface and host. It had never needed to account for 8 hosts coordinating behavior simultaneously because the species the Veth had integrated before had not had human communication patterns. Most of them were hive-adjacent or hierarchical in ways that the Veth understood and had already modeled. Humans were neither. Humans were chaotic in exactly the way that made chaos useful. The plan was not elegant. Mara would have preferred elegant. She had the kind of mind that liked clean solutions, efficient paths. But clean solutions were a luxury, and she'd spent enough of her life without luxuries to know how to work without them. On the morning of the 14th day after implantation, all 8 of the integrated workers began simultaneously exhibiting what the Veth medical model classified as stress response anomalies. Not the same anomalies, that would have been too easy to categorize. Different ones. Torben's heart rate was elevated. Daisy's cortisol markers were spiking. A woman named Petra, who'd done the integration contract to pay for her daughter's secondary education, was running a slight temperature. A man named Callow, who nobody had thought would be much use, turned out to be extraordinarily good at controlling his own breathing and blood pressure, and he was currently presenting the biometric profile of someone in acute panic while his face was completely blank. 8 simultaneous anomalies with 8 different profiles. The interface flagged all of them. Its correction protocols activated. And here was the thing about correction protocols designed by a species that had never had to run 8 simultaneous corrections before, were not built for the load. The Veth system was designed for precision. Precision required focus. 8 divergent targets simultaneously requiring different calibrated responses was not a problem the system had ever been asked to solve. And it solved it the way any overconstrained system solves an impossible problem, badly and with visible strain. The correction stimuli misfired. 2 of them triggered on the wrong targets. 1 of them produced no effect at all. Mara felt the one aimed at her arrive late and weak, like a radio signal at the edge of range, and she pushed through it in the time it took to draw one slow breath. She was already moving. The Veth Integration Oversight Hub was on sub-level 2, 1 deck below the fabrication bays, in a room that hummed with the kind of constant frequency Mara had learned to feel in her teeth. She had been inside it exactly once, day of her procedure. She had looked at everything the way she always looked at everything, quietly, thoroughly filing it away. She knew where the primary calibration terminals were. She knew which of the terminals interfaced directly with the integration server rather than routing through the station's main network. She knew this because she had read the room's equipment ID plates and then spent 3 evenings cross-referencing the IDs against the station's publicly accessible maintenance manifests. Listed every piece of equipment and its connectivity specifications, because the Veth were thorough record keepers, and they had simply never imagined a host would spend her evenings reading equipment manifests. She had 40 seconds before the system recovered. She used 38 of them. What she did to the integration server was not sophisticated. It was not a hack in the technical sense. It was the equipment equivalent of pulling a load-bearing piece out of a structure that was already under stress. Finding the one connection that the system was relying on to manage its current overload and removing it cleanly, the way her father had taught her to pull a stuck fence post, not by force, but by understanding where the tension was and working with it rather than against it. The correction system crashed, not permanently. The Veth would restore it within the hour. But in the space of that crash, 8 people pulled their chips. The removal was not supposed to be possible without medical assistance. The consent form had been very clear about this. The consent form had not accounted for was that 3 of the 8 integrated workers had medical backgrounds. Mara had read every piece of technical documentation she could access about the Lex interface architecture, and that Torben had built a simple extraction tool out of components from 3 different maintenance kits in a way that the individual component requisitions would never have flagged. It hurt. She wasn't going to pretend it didn't hurt. She sat in Bay 4 afterward with a Diaze's hand on her shoulder and her ears ringing and a small smear of blood on her collar, and she felt, specifically, like a person who had just done something very difficult and was going to feel it for several days. S came to find her 22 minutes later. It stood in the doorway of Bay 4 and it looked at her. Its kind of looking amber optical sensors doing their slow, precise work, and Mara looked back at it. S said, after a very long pause, that this outcome had not been predicted by the model. Mara said that was a reasonable summary of the situation. S said the contract had specified compliance. Mara said the contract had also specified the program was voluntary. S said removal outside of the medical protocol was a violation. Mara said that a correction system that overrode the host's motor control when the host declined to board a transport was also, she thought, something the contract hadn't quite covered, and she was willing to discuss both violations simultaneously if S wanted to have that conversation. Another long pause. The Veth, she had come to understand, were not comfortable with the space between a clear rule and a complicated reality. They had built their civilization on the premise that those spaces could be closed, optimized away, reduced to 0. They had integrated 17 species without ever encountering a species that would sit in that space and argue from inside it. S said it would need to consult with oversight. Mara said, take your time. She walked back to the commissary. She wasn't hungry, but she got a cup of coffee, real coffee, station grown, one of Adaze's crop cycles, and she sat at the same table where the voice had first spoken to her 8 days ago, and she wrapped both hands around cup and felt the warmth of it. Callow appeared across the table, then Petra, then Torben, who sat down sideways on the bench with his long legs stretched out and his eyes at the ceiling, and said, without looking at anyone, probably going to have a complicated few weeks. Mara said, probably. He said, worth it? She thought about her mother. She thought about 4,000 credits and what it cost to buy someone more time. She thought about a voice that arrived behind her ears and said, compliance is optimal. As if it had never occurred to anyone that the person it was talking to might have a different opinion. Yeah, she said. Worth it. She drank her coffee. It was good coffee. Adaze grew it in the second row of Bay 7, in a hydroponic setup she'd modified on her own time to produce 30% more yield than the standard configuration. Because Adaze was that kind of person. The Veth returned 4 days later with a different approach. Not correction, but negotiation. This was, Mara would later learn, unprecedented. The integration program had run for 260 years across 17 species without producing negotiation. The Veth brought a diplomat, a medical officer, and a systems architect who had been involved in the original Lex design. They sat across a table from Mara and 6 of the other 7. Callow was doing his shift, and they put new documents on the table with different numbers on them and clauses that used the word voluntary. Carefully than before, Mara read every line. She passed pages to Torben when she wanted a second set of eyes. She asked 3 questions, which the systems architect answered with something that might have been discomfort or might have been the Veth equivalent of surprise. At the end, she looked at the number they'd put on the table, which was substantially larger than 4,000. She said she needed to talk to the others privately. The Veth waited in the corridor. Mara looked at the 6 people around the table, Adaze, Torben, Petra, 2 others named Jun and Silka, a man named Osei, who had barely spoken in 12 days and turned out to have the steadiest hands she'd ever scene. And she said, "I'm not taking it, but it's your choice, and I mean that." Petra said, "What do you want instead?" Mara said, "Want to go home. I want them to pay for Miss Mother's treatment. I want them to redesign the correction protocols, not just for us, not just for humans, for all of it. I want a review of every integration contract they've run, and I want humans involved in the review." Silk said, "They're not going to give us all of that." Mara said, "Probably not, but they've never had to negotiate before. We're the reason they're learning. That's worth something." She paused. "And I want it on record that the system failed. Not us, the system." Say, who had barely spoken, said quietly, "They'll say the anomaly was us." "Yes," Mara said, "so we say it back. Loud." They went back in. Negotiation took 6 hours. Mara drank 3 cups of coffee during it. The Veth architect left twice to make calls she couldn't hear. Diplomat developed a habit of very slightly shifting its posture whenever it was about to concede a point, which she clocked on the second occurrence and watched for, carefully, every time after that. They got most of it. Not all. The review clause was narrower than she wanted, covering only human integration contracts for the next 15 years, not the full archive. The correction protocol redesign was agreed to, in principle, with a timeline she thought was too long. The medical coverage for her mother went through as written. It was not a clean solution. It was not elegant. But it was real, and it was theirs. And they had arrived at it from inside a situation that was supposed to have no exit. On her last night on Reach 7, Mara sat in a Daisy's hydroponics bay on the floor between the Mabine plants, the warm green smell around her and the hum of the growing lights above. A Dazay sat beside her. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much that needed saying. The chip was gone. The space where it had been still felt strange sometimes, the way a tooth socket feels strange after an extraction, that awareness of absence. She thought she would always feel it a little, always know where it had been, the way you always know the shape of something that tried to change you. But she also thought it hadn't. Changed her in the ways it wanted to. It had tried, and she had been too much herself, too specific, too stubborn, too full of oatmeal and coffee and the specific texture of a problem she intended to work through. The Veth had built a system that assumed the host would give way when pressed. She had not given way. None of them had. And that fact was now in their models, a new variable, a thing that hadn't been in the data before. She wondered if it would make them more careful. She thought probably yes. She wondered if more careful was the same as better. She thought that was a longer conversation. Adize handed her a small cloth bag that was warm to the touch. Mara opened it. It was coffee, fresh-dried a week's worth. For the trip, Adize said. Mara held it in both hands. She thought about her father and floods and what you do when the water comes. You save what you can carry, and you stand on high ground and you wait for it to recede, and then you go back down and you start rebuilding, and you keep the knowledge of the flood because the knowledge is what lets you build the levee higher next time. "Thank you," she said. She didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, she got on a transport that was going in the right direction. She watched Reach 7 diminish through the narrow porthole until it was just a point of light among other points of light. Then she couldn't tell it from the stars. She had 940 credits and a settlement figure that was enough to buy her mother time. She had 6 people in her contacts who had held a line with her, which was more than she'd had before. She had a bruise behind her right ear that was fading. She opened a new document on her terminal and began writing down everything she remembered. In order, in detail, because someone else would eventually need to know how it worked and how it failed and which lever, precisely, you had to pull. She wasn't sure what you called a person who did that. She knew what the Veth would call her. She thought her father might have had a word for it too, from the old language, the one that meant something like, the one who stays and figures it out. She wrote until the coffee ran out. Then she kept writing.